with the register. Shelby and I are with the register. I know, I'm pressed, I'm pressed, I'm pressed, I'm pressed, I'm pressed, I'm going. I'm pressed, I'm pressed, I'm going, I'm pressed. I'm with the Des Moines Register, I'm going. I'm with the Des Moines Register, I'm going. I'm with the Des Moines Register. I'm with the Des Moines Register. Okay, I just got pepper sprayed in one eye.
Next, you know it, a whole wall of State Patrol were marching towards us.
Then I felt tear gas in my right eye.
The police threw in flashbang grenades.
The officer had singled me out.
I saw
and
pepper spray
sprayed me
descending upon my camera.
And so I squeezed my eyes shut and raised my hands and started yelling, I'm pressed.
I was clearly media.
I had TV written on my flak jacket.
Had my press pass on.
I had my notebook in my hands.
I had my cameras, I was live streaming.
And I'm yelling back like, I'm press, like here's my press pass.
And then the doctor said the next thing is you don't have an eye. You lost your left eye.
That jump from confusion to realization that they were targeting photographers and video journalists and reporters shifted the way I was approaching the situation.
They straight up just like targeted us, and I got shot in the face with a concussion grenade that like exploded in front of me.
So what you're seeing is police deliberately targeting people who are attempting to news gather.
So in these rapidly evolving situations, sometimes tempers flare. Officers maybe don't know who the reporter is. Maybe they do.
Most police officers know the difference between a rock and a notepad or a camera.
Our challenge with that is that there's other dynamics that have changed, especially in the last 10 years. Not just the fact that everybody now considers themselves a journalist.
You can't just throw up your hands and say, well, because this job has gotten more complicated, we're going to disregard the fundamental rights that journalists have under the First Amendment.
It's a very basic question of press freedom. Are the press going to be allowed to operate in a public space, a space that belongs to everyone, to continue exercising the function they're supposed to exercise, which is holding the powerful to account and ensuring that the voices of the people get heard?
The issue of press freedom at protests and the relationship with police, it's episodic throughout American history. Every time there are large-scale protests, this issue emerges because it's unresolved.
In 2020, we saw the largest social movement in United States history. We saw protests emerge in, I believe, all 50 states and a number of U.S. territories.
And during the course of those protests, 129 journalists were arrested.
And upwards of 400 who were physically attacked. 80% of those attacks were allegedly at the hands of the police.
129 journalists arrested across the United States in a single year. It's absolutely shocking. It's just mind-boggling.
The problem is the press today doesn't want to be clearly identified in these protests.
And raised my hands and started yelling, I'm pressed.
I had my press pass on.
I was clearly media.
We don't know who the press are. And oftentimes what will happen is when they feel they were singled out, maybe they were shot with a pepper ball gun or an R1 round, and they believe that it was intentional.
We can de-escalate this whole situation if cops just understand that somebody who's video recording, taking photos, and they see them doing this, just leave them alone. It's not that hard. It's really not that hard.
I had a camera across me, I had a press badge, and I had my hands up standing behind him going, I'm pressed, don't shoot, don't shoot, don't shoot. There's no other protesters around us, and they shoot at us.
We've been fired at with rubber bullets. My cameraman has been hit. We've also seen tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again. This is exactly what it looks like. Exactly what it looks like. We're just staying safely.
Oh.
Whoa. Oh.
Amelia, can you hear us?
Amelia, you okay?
They just shot at that man. He clearly has press on his helmet right there.
Get going. Go. Where do I go? I'm with WCCO.
The biggest concerns that I hear from law enforcement is who is a journalist? How do we get to decide in the heat of what they consider a battle, who's a journalist and who's not a journalist? They're worried that their officers are going to hesitate on things that might cost them their lives. Our position is you need to do a better job.
It's hard to believe that the question is really whether law enforcement can differentiate between someone who is a news gatherer and someone who is not. When you have this many incidents, that doesn't look like an accident, that looks like punishment.
I'm pressed.
I'm pressed.
That's why these conversations are happening, because apparently it's very hard to understand who is and who isn't a journalist.
You know, I feel like that definition has changed through time, because I think we used to define a journalist as someone who is a full-time staffer at a legacy publication. That's just not the case anymore.
The fact is that nowadays pretty much everybody's got a cell phone. Every cell phone has a camera.
The media has been transformed by technology. And in many instances, journalism is done not by professionals, but by average people who assumed a journalistic role.
We're losing news media outlets at a breakneck pace. And so what a journalist looks like is changing and it's evolving. And so you can't look at someone and say, that's a journalist. You have to look at the behavior. What are they doing? Are they doing the process of journalism?
To the journalist, all news travels fast. Once inside the office...
What are the biases that are in place within law enforcement agencies that tell them what a journalist is supposed to look like? We're not in the 1920s anymore, where journalists were wearing suits and ties with a little piece of paper that said press and wearing a hat saying, "Man, I'm a journalist." Like, that's not a thing anymore, right? Journalists look like so many different people, so many different colors, ages, backgrounds, and in the collection of all of this information and all of the documentation from journalists who had been detained, injured, or arrested over this one-year period of time, the majority of them were journalists of color.
When police are empowered, particularly in the context of a demonstration, particularly in the context of a demonstration about racial justice, particularly in the context about police violence, when they are empowered to determine who is and who is not a journalist, they're going to make those judgments within a racialized framework.
There is a huge feeling of unfairness when you see an older white photographer, photojournalist, crossing police lines without any type of issue. All the while, I'm struggling, just trying to not get pushed back by a baton, doing the same job that this person's doing.
We saw television journalists being arrested on camera while they were clearly trying to report a story. Why is it that journalists of color were abundantly targeted in these situations?
I'm sorry?
You're under arrest.
Okay. Do you mind telling me
whoa.
why I'm under arrest, sir? Why am I under arrest, sir?
Officer's with CNN and he's on the air right now.
You are watching our correspondent, Omar Jimenez, being arrested by state police in Minnesota. We're not sure why our correspondent is being arrested.
The U.S. Constitution specifically guarantees the right for freedom of the press and identifies it as a specific occupation.
And it's the only industry, the only profession that's actually codified in our Constitution.
The First Amendment says,
Congress shall make no law
respecting an establishment of religion
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
or abridging the freedom of speech,
or of the press,
or of the press,
or of the press.
Logically, you would say, well, there needs to be some kind of definition that a member of the press isn't simply a member of the public who has a smartphone. So I would say it's a gap the size of the Grand Canyon for us in policing to do right by the press, to do right by the public, for a definition. Who should give us that definition?
The First Amendment has a press clause.
The press clause.
The press clause.
The press clause of the First Amendment ensure, let me just say it differently. Because it's actually not that straight, because no one actually knows exactly what the press clause does. So
the Constitution protects the freedom of the press. And many people read this and think that that is where all of journalists' rights and protections come from.
When I talk about the First Amendment, even though I think most people look at it as freedom of the press and the press getting certain privileges, to me it's more about the right of the public to be informed.
What we can't have is anyone law enforcement, protesters, the government, anyone impeding that right of a journalist to be able to keep the public informed.
So far, when courts have ruled on these issues, they've grounded those rights in the First Amendment's protection of the freedom of speech. And they found that journalists have these rights, which aren't unique to journalists, that the public also shares, like the right to record or the right of access, the right to be there at the protests.
You know, we are the first draft of history, right? And if we're not able to get the information we need to make that first draft of history, information is lost.
On May 29th, that evening, when law enforcement started to clear the streets with tear gas, I started filming these police officers, and I noticed and could hear rubber bullets whizzing by me and one hitting my shoe. That's when I looked around, and then they kept shooting, and I was like, oh, they're targeting us. On May 30th, I wasn't sure what State Patrol was going to be doing, and at that time, I was filming the crowd facing this wall of law enforcement heading towards them.
And they just started shooting projectiles towards us, and we were like, oh my God, like, they can't be doing this.
So my gut instinct at that point was to get out of there. As I was climbing over the wall, 2 State Patrol grabbed me and lifted me and pushed me off, yelling, get the fuck out of there.
And then Mike met me on the other side and was visibly shaken.
Were you clearly marked as press?
Yeah, I had my press credential, my helmet, my mask, and a pretty big camera that's, I assume, is very clearly stating that I'm media.
It's hard to say that what we saw in 2020 was worse qualitatively than what I documented in Ferguson in 2014, or what you saw the NYPD doing during the Occupy protests that were in New York City in 2011. Deliberate interference with the ability to gather news, to document a scene. You're seeing police ignoring people who are showing them press credentials and saying, I'm press. You're seeing police get violent with people who are there, who say they're journalists or who are clearly engaged in news gathering.
I'm getting shot!
What we saw in 2020 is not especially unique if you are looking back over the past several decades of the way police and protesters and journalists interact at protest scenes, particularly when they are about questions of racial justice or social justice issues.
I've covered other riots where I've seen individual police officers panic, but I've never seen a concerted effort, as this one obviously is among some contingents of the police force.
At that time, he noticed that I was taping the whole proceedings. He then grabbed my microphone and ripped it off the machine here.
When the civil rights movement erupted, beginning in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, there was something happening in the information space that allowed the civil rights movement to take hold, and that was the development of a national media and a national broadcast media. Many of the protests, civil rights protests that were taking place in the South, were covered by journalists from national media organizations, and they documented the brutality. They brought it into people's living rooms. They brought this reality, this shame, into public view. And John Lewis, the civil rights leader and later congressman, described the role of the media in the civil rights movement. He said it would not have been possible without the media.
I've often said that without members of the press, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings.
Look at what happened with the murder of George Floyd. I mean, okay, that was not a journalist who documented that killing. It was a bystander, Darnella Frazier. But her role was recognized in that moment. She was performing a journalistic function. Imagine how different our history would be if the police had prohibited or prevented her from doing that, from documenting what occurred. Journalism is a profession, but it's also an activity, it's an action. There are people who have a professional identity as a journalist, but what about the people who engage in journalism but don't have a professional identity?
6 people face multiple felonies and 50 years in prison for just being in the area where anti-fascist and anti-capitalist protesters were marching.
What was outrageous and startling about the Alexei Wood case was the fact that journalists were being charged with rioting.
We were all charged with at least 8 felonies. Felony conspiracy to riot, felony rioting, and felony incitement to riot, and then 5 felony property destruction.
The legal theory asserted by the prosecutor was that he was part of a conspiracy to riot, even though there was no evidence that he'd engaged in property destruction himself.
The live stream proved that I didn't do a single quote-unquote illegal act. I didn't do any property destruction, I didn't spray paint anything, but I sure enjoyed other people doing it.
Woo! Woo! Holy motherfucking shit, y'all.
So I was there in full press capacity, but I'm also an anarchist. And so I'm anti-capitalist, I'm anti-fascism.
None of that matters. What matters was that his role was to document their activities, to disseminate it to the public, and he was fulfilling that role when he was arrested and prosecuted.
I make no claim to be a traditional journalist. You know, this is new media, this is live streaming, this is immersion journalism. I don't care about wearing a tie and pretending that I'm objective. According to my trial, according to Judge Leibowitz, that expression of enthusiasm is a constitutionally protected First Amendment activity. United States versus Wood.
It shouldn't depend on who you work for, what your business card says, where you went to school. What should be protected is the act of news gathering.
And from a practical perspective, we have to make sure that those rights are protected and that law enforcement recognizes and respects the fact that anyone who's engaged in the exercise of documenting and disseminating information to the public should be entitled to engage in those activities with the full protection of the law. It's that simple. Democracy depends on the ability of journalists and people engaged in journalism to document the activities of law enforcement so that other fundamental rights are protected.
Because the second that you start to detain, arrest, and injure journalists, it not only has this chilling effect where other journalists are like, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to go there and cover that story. I might get hurt, I might get detained, I might be arrested.
It's going to give you pause about the next time you go back out there, or whether you even are willing to go back out there a next time.
The rhetoric is, oh, I had a 5-week trial and I got full acquittals and the system works. And the reality is, I quit journalism.
It prevents the information from getting to the public.
The press makes it easier for protesters to get their message out and to get their message out safely.
But the kind of understanding the relationship, the normative structures that have made that possible have eroded so deeply that we're at a very fragile, precarious moment.
And for me, as a journalist, as a journalism professor, that's not acceptable. It's non-negotiable. We have to fight for those things. We have to ensure that journalists have access. We have to ensure that they're be able to do their First Amendment protected jobs.
The first thing we need to do is reach a consensus about the problem. And the problem is that police are resisting the notion that they have a responsibility to protect the rights of all those who are engaged in journalism, whether they have a professional identity as a journalist or not.
It's not enough to just say, this is the best we can do.
We don't need these crazy nuanced conversations to understand that. And I'm sure that cops, hopefully they don't need these nuanced conversations to understand that.
The underlying fragility of this dynamic, so essential to democracy, is unresolved. And the next time there are large-scale protests, and there inevitably will be, you know, the pieces of fabric that are kind of holding this together may tear completely.
I need help. I'm a journalist. I need help. Hey, I'm a journalist. I really need help right now. Sorry.